Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, as it always is at the Wilderness Wildlife Week. How many are here for the first time this year? Good. We've got some first-timers. As the gentleman just said, I'm the Sevier County historian, and from time to time I come across very interesting stories. At least they're very interesting to me. And a few years back, for the first time in my life, and I grew up here, I heard about what someone termed as the Groom's tune, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And with my curious nature, I decided to get to the bottom of it. And the more I researched the story, the more interesting it became. It became just a very interesting story. And you know, you have those moments when you're researching something when you think, oh, wow, and then you have these other moments you think, I wish I'd have known this at a certain time in my life. And it turns out that at one time in my life, when I was a teenager, I worked with Jewel Dodgen at the Ogle's grocery store in Gatlinburg, and she was a relative of Henry Groom's, who we're going to talk about today. And if I'd have only known that then and could have sat down and talked to her about that, she might have been able to dotted some of the I's and cross some of the T's that none of us left can do now. But that's another story for another time. Today we're going to talk about the Groom's tune. And the essence of this story is that there were two brothers and a brother-in-law that was captured by a somewhat evil Confederate officer by the name of Albert Teague. Just at the end of the Civil War, and they were taken away from their home, and they were all murdered, brutally murdered. And just before one of the three died, he asked if he could play a tune on his fiddle, and he played an old tune that's called Bonaparte's Retreat. Well, afterwards, local people in the mountains heard the story, and they started, when they would play Bonaparte's Retreat, they would call it the Groom's tune in memory of Henry Groom's. So it became quite a folk tale here in the mountains of East Tennessee and western North Carolina. Now, I mentioned just a minute ago, there's some T's not crossed and some I's not dotted, but the essence of the story is there. And they are different versions. It's been handed down by different family members in the Groom's family. We're lucky to have some nieces of Henry, grandnieces, or great-grandnieces of Henry Groom's that are here with us today. So we'll have a little question and answer session a little bit later. But today I'm going to tell the story as best that we've been able to piece it together. And there may be other people that would tell it a little bit differently, but in the end, the essence of the story is the same no matter who tells it, with the exception of the fact that we think we have the real fiddle right here that you can see afterwards, and Dollywood says that they have the real one. But we're pretty sure that this is it. But anyway, we'll get into all of that as the story unravels. That just makes it a little more interesting. And let me start back by going back just a little bit to the Civil War here in the mountains of western North Carolina and East Tennessee. For any of you that have studied Civil War history here in the mountains, it was a very unique situation during the Civil War because most of the people, particularly on the Tennessee side of the mountain, were Union loyalists. There were very few Confederate sympathizers here in Sevier County in particular. They had 3 votes on secession from the Union, and each time they voted, the most votes that they ever got for secession was 8, I think. 8 men voted to secede, and everyone else voted to remain in the Union. So on the 3rd vote, it was final, and the state at large voted to secede from the Union. But there were so few Confederate sympathizers here that most of the men who could somehow managed to go off somewhere and join up with the Union forces. There were very few men here that fought for the Confederacy. Now, some stayed loyal to their state, even though they had different passions. And then there were a few that that sympathized with the Confederate cause, but it was an overwhelming Union area in a Confederate state. And that was somewhat true over on the North Carolina side as well. However, over on the North Carolina side, Colonel Thomas, who many of you probably heard about, led what was called the Thomas Legion, and he went around this region, both sides of the mountain, conscripting people into the Confederate Army. And he didn't give them any choice. They were threatened. There's documented cases up in Pittman Center and all over this area where people would refuse to join up with him, and he said, well, you know, if you don't, your families aren't going to be safe. So what happened in lots of cases was that men would say, okay, I'll join up with the Thomas Legion. They did, and when they got away from here, they deserted and joined with the Union forces. And there's all kinds of documentation, and the Department of War Pensions had headaches for close to 100 years after that war trying to sort out pension claims because of that. They would deny claims saying, well, you fought for the Confederacy, and they would have to explain, well, yes, I did, but I only joined them so I could get away till I could join the Union Army. So it was a very confusing time. Well, the people that did join the Union Army, in most cases, the Union Army did not have the monies necessary to provide adequate equipment. And they were literally, in some cases, fighting barefoot. Their shoes, the soles would wear out on their shoes, and they were fighting barefoot. It was just a horrible, horrible time. And as bad as it was for the soldiers, it was even worse for the women, the young children, and the older men that was left behind. Being in this area where it's a Confederate state again, Union sympathizers, when the Union Home Guard and the Union soldiers came through, they said, oh, well, this is a Confederate area, and they just took what they wanted from the farmers and the farmland. They would take what little bit of food they had stored up, they'd take their livestock, they'd take anything they wanted. Well, when the Confederates came through, they'd say, well, these people are all sympathizers of the Union, so they did the same thing. So you had your Union Army, your Confederate Army, you had your Union Home Guard, you had your Confederate Home Guard. You had all of those people preying on the innocent women and children and the older men. And what the Home Guard was doing was going around and finding any man that they defined as a man, and that could be any boy over 12 years old, up to, they considered an old man a lot younger than what I consider an old man today at my age. But anyway, anyone that was, say, 50 years or older that wasn't in the Army. And they didn't ask any questions in lots of cases. They would just shoot them right on the spot, or they would capture them and take them to prison. And Colonel Albert Tigg was just notorious for this type of action. Now, he was not actually with the Home Guard. He was actually under Colonel Thomas. But he went out and he found anyone he could find. He had men fighting under him. There was this notorious case that happened over in Madison County, North Carolina, where he ordered his men to massacre 13 people, and it was mostly young boys and men of grandparents' age. Some of his men that fought under him stood there with tears in their eyes, begging him not to make them do it, and he told them it was either them or the victims to take their choice. One man said that he didn't sign up to kill little boys and old grandpas, and he wouldn't do it. So Tigg shot him right on the spot. So the others then massacred 13 people. That's just one example of what was going on. Well, as the 4 years of the war came to pass, soldiers started coming back home. Union soldiers who had fought in the battle and here and the battle there, they decided it was time to come back home to their families and take care. They didn't wait on discharge papers. There wasn't so much of that discharging back then. They just came on back home. So there were a lot of cases with that. Well, when they'd get back to the mountains of North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, here was old Tigg waiting on them. So it's really, really a horrible time. a few instances that happened right here in Sevierville. Some of Colonel Thomas's people came over, and the Union forces had some of Colonel Thomas's people imprisoned in the Sevier County Courthouse. Well, Thomas sent his legion down, and they bombarded the courthouse, shot old Jonathan Mize, who was a Union home guard that was about 60 years old that was guarding the courthouse, shot him in cold blood right out front, and freed their men and took them back to Gatlinburg. And then Union forces came, and the Battle of Berg Hill happened in Gatlinburg. Wasn't much of a battle to it because Colonel Thomas was outnumbered up there, but all of that happened right here in Sevier County. And they captured this old black man that they found in town, and they asked him some questions which he was not able to answer. And because he was not able to answer those questions, they tied him to the back of a horse, stripped him of his clothes. And this was before the days of pavements. It was just rock roads. Drug him down the streets with signs saying that this is what happens to, and use the N-word, that don't answer our questions. And that was just the type of things that people were having to do, not to mention that they were about to starve to death. Practically every church in this area, on both sides of the mountain, disbanded during the Civil War because they were afraid to congregate. And they lived in constant fear. And there was very little socializing. Everyone stayed to themselves. And if you come here and you're not a native and you hear people say, well, they're really clannish around there, that's the reason. That's how that ever came about. All they could depend on was their clan. And in some cases, they were divided clans that fought for different sides. So you had to be very careful about who you even talked to, about your politics and that sort of thing. So it was a very, very scary time. The war finally was coming to an end in April of 1865. And it was on April 9th of 1865 that Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. But that was a long time before cell phones, so word didn't spread quite as fast as it does now. So word had not come down to the hills of North Carolina and Tennessee by the following day. And this is when this incident happened with the Groom's brothers and Henry Groom's brother-in-law. There was Henry Groom's, his brother George, and Henry's brother-in-law, Mitchell Caldwell. Now, Mitchell Caldwell was what they called at that time simple-minded. Translated today, he was probably mentally retarded. And there's varying stories as to how they were actually apprehended. One of the stories that's prevailing in most accounts is that they were all working in the fields. Would make sense. It was April, and they had come back home to tend to their crops, to try to get crops started to go on with their lives and feed their families who were about to starve to death. And others think that they were spied in the field and were taken in later. But anyway, somehow Tig and his men captured George Groom's, Henry Groom's, and Henry Groom's brother-in-law, Mitchell Caldwell. Mitchell was just a young teenager at the time. And somehow Henry Groom's managed to bring his fiddle with him. He was a fiddle player. That's part of the puzzle that we just can't quite piece together. It makes more sense that he was probably taken from his home, spotted in the field, and then taken from his home. But we don't know for sure. But anyway, they left. He probably was thinking that he was being taken to Waynesville, to prison, to jail. A little backstory on the Groom's family here. There was another brother who, a few years earlier, Solomon Groom's, had been charged with an axe murder, was tried in Waynesville after spending some time in jail there, was convicted and hanged there in Waynesville, North Carolina for the axe murder. So they were quite familiar that there was a jail in Waynesville and all of that. So they assumed that as prisoners of war, they were being taken to Waynesville. So it makes sense that a fiddle player would ask if he could bring along his fiddle. So somehow the three men and their fiddle left. But instead of taking them to Waynesville. They took them up near the state line, up near Mount Sterling. And there, at some point, we don't know if this was the plan from the beginning, or if there was a change of heart, because we do know that George was cussing them. He was not very happy, and he was making that known. So maybe they decided, well, we've listened to all this we're going to do. We're just going to kill them right here and now. Maybe that was their plan all along. We just don't know. But anyway, they got up near the state line, and they decided to tie George and Caldwell to a tree and shoot them. Well, of course, George just kept on cussing them until they shot him, and he was dead, tied to the tree. And this is your grandfather, right? No, this is your uncle also, yeah. They're the descendants of a younger brother, Anderson. There was a big family of 9 children, so you have to think it through sometimes. But anyway, George was dead, and they turned to Caldwell. Well, as I mentioned, Caldwell was mentally challenged, and he smiled all the time. It was just what he did. He just smiled. And it just unnerved the soldiers that this guy, who obviously was quite young and is obviously mentally disturbed, was smiling at them, and they just couldn't do it. So they made Caldwell put his hat over his head so they couldn't see him smile, and they shot him and killed him. Then they tied Henry to a tree and started to kill him, and Henry asked if he could pray before they shot him. And one man in the group said, well, you can pray before we shoot you if you'll play us a tune on that fiddle. Everyone loved fiddle playing back then. That was accustomed to Justin Timberlake today being there, and you ask him to sing a song. That's the type of entertainment that people loved. So he agreed that he'd play a tune on the fiddle if they would let him pray before they shot him. So at that time, he chose Bonaparte's Retreat. So we're going to try to play that tune for you right here.
That's the bowling part. That's the bowling part.
Sound familiar to anyone? Now, this particular version is in the Library of Congress, and it was recorded back in 1937. And we feel like that's probably closer to the way it sounded. You can get on YouTube today and find all kinds of versions of Bonaparte's Retreat. But it was said that because of that tune and the way it sounded, that dogs would be howling when the fiddle players would play that. And I can just almost imagine this mountain scene in such horrible, horrible circumstances when this very nervous, scared young man started playing this Bonaparte's Retreat on his fiddle, that you could hear dogs howling all over the valley there because they could hear it, for, of course, long distances away. But anyway, he played the tune, I guess thinking maybe, we can assume that he thought maybe that because they enjoyed the tune, that they might spare his life. He had a family, so of course he wanted to live. But they didn't. They let him say his prayer. And I've often wondered what that prayer was, what he might have said. Of course, we'll never know exactly what it was that he said. But he prayed to his almighty God, and then tied to a tree, they shot him dead. They'd killed all 3 of them for no reason except that Albert Tigg just decided to kill anyone he wanted to kill and did. Well, there was someone who had followed along, probably a family member. We suspect it was their grandfather, great-grandfather, Anderson, who followed along. You know, being younger, he could have He knew the area. It was only 8 miles from where they lived, and 8 miles walking for a young boy back in those days was nothing. So he probably followed them and witnessed the whole thing, and went back home and told Eliza, Henry's mother, or Henry's wife, I'm sorry, and Mitchell's sister, what had happened. Well, she came and she brought along a young boy, and all we know about him was that his last name was Sutton. Everyone seems to agree that his name was Sutton. He's always called the Sutton boy. And he had to be a young boy because most of the men were away at war. So they came up with a horse and a cart. They untied the men, put them on the back of the cart, took them to a nearby cemetery, the Sutton Cemetery up there near the state line, and buried the 3 bodies. Now, there's been varying accounts. Some people say that they were put in a pine box, in a common pine box, and buried in one grave. I tend to think that that would have been too much to, under those conditions, to build a box to put them in. I think it was probably all they could do to lift those heavy men and bury them in a shallow grave there in the cemetery. And we know it was quite shallow because it wasn't long after that till a witness came by the graves and the feral hogs had dug them up and were chomping on the bodies. That was how grotesque the whole scene was. But anyway, the war had ended. News finally scattered all around the hills and valleys that the war was over, and the story got out about the Groom's brothers and how Henry Grooms, who was a well-known fiddle player, beforehand, so everyone knew how adept he was at playing the fiddle, that he had chosen to play Bonaparte's Retreat. Well, for a long time after the Civil War, one of the best forms of entertainment for mountain folks was fiddle players. So fiddle players, when they would play Bonaparte's Retreat, would introduce it and often tell that story, and that's how the folk tale has stayed alive down through the years. And that's why, you hear little varying stories, because people change things a little bit. But as I say, the essence of the story remains the same. But they began to tell that they were going to play the Groom's tune. So here ever after, in these mountains of western North Carolina and East Tennessee, Bonaparte's Retreat, which goes back much further than that, has been called the Groom's tune. Very sad but true story of just one but many instances that happened during the Civil War. Now, I told you that we have some of the relatives here, so at this time we're going to just have a little question and answer session. I'm sure some of you have questions. We may not be able to answer all of your questions, and if we don't know the answer, we'll just tell you we don't know, but if we do, we'll try to answer them for you. And if any of you have heard varying stories, these folk tales are ongoing history. We need to find out any little tidbits we can to add to the story. So this time I'm going to ask Donna, and Pam, are you coming up as well? Pam has the fiddle that she's going to show you as well. I don't think we're going to pass it around because it's so delicate, but if any of you want to come up and get a better look. And this is the one that we assume that Henry Grooms actually played. Now, we don't know where the one that's at Dollywood comes from, but somehow through her Rayfield relatives, they have said that that was the one. But the best we can determine, Dolly's line is from Solomon, the axe murderer, who had already been put to death before this incident happened. So that lends more credence to the fact that this is the real fiddle right here. So at this time, I'll let them introduce themselves just a little bit better than I have, and then we will take questions.
I'm Donna Grooms Ogle.
And I'm Pamela Grooms Ogle. Bonneville. Sorry.
They already think everyone here is an ogle. Don't confuse them. Any questions? Yes, sir.
You would think under the circumstances after they shot these boys, typically they were taking everything that wasn't nailed down. They would have gotten to it.
Well, at that time, there was a battle getting ready to happen in Asheville, even though Lee had already signed with Grant the surrender. The Confederacy had not given up Asheville, so the Union troops were coming in to take Asheville back, and the Confederacy was coming in to keep Asheville. So that area right there was full of soldiers, home guard, people trying to get home. And so what we figure is the reason they didn't take them to Waynesville and took them to Sterling Gap was because the Union Army was there instead of being over here.
Yes, sir.
I can tell you when we get home.
Well, no, these others might like to hear the answer as well. Go ahead.
What's your question?
I was just wondering, like, 'cause I got in a little early. What is their parents if they died?
What did George and Anera do?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's part of it that we don't know. They were in North Carolina still. They had not died yet, but we don't know what they did. According to what my grandfather, Sanders' early grooms, which is, if you think about that, you had Sanders came out of the Union and Early came out of the Confederacy as far as names went. So you had another kind of mystery there. But Papa says that according to what he was told, that Anderson came back across the mountain and told the family it was in Cott County, and then they went back. And according to what Papa has written, is they went back and killed the men who killed George and Henry and Mitchell. But Teague did not die. After the war was over with, at whatever point, he ran to Texas, and so he didn't die until in the 1900s, the early 1900s. So, little mystery there too. We've got kind of a murder mystery here. So,
Another thing worth mentioning, if any of you ever go to the cemetery up there, there's only one grave marker. It's an old slate marker, and it has the name of Mitchell Caldwell on it. It says that he was killed, I think, does it say killed with the Confederates or something?
murdered.
Murdered
is on it.
Murdered or something like that. And we don't know if there were 3 markers there at one time. It's been over 150 years. They well could have been. Or if there was just the one, or if they moved the other 2 later. We don't think so, but we don't know for sure about that. But there's only the one grave marker up there.
How was it discovered? Our grandfather gave it to our father, Jack Grooms. And I guess he gave it to Daddy because he was a musician. And he had a bluegrass show in Gatlinburg from 1954, 1952, up until 1998. So I assume that's why that Papa ended up giving it to him. And his dad, Lewis Anderson, was Anderson's son. So it's passed down as such. Because Lewis Anderson did not have, I think Papa was Early was the only son that there was. So I went down through the sons, and so we ended up with it when my father passed away.
Just a footnote, those of you that have been around Gatlinburg long enough may remember Homespun Valley. Early Grooms operated Homespun Valley. He was their grandfather. And their father used to be one of those musicians, if you were eating at a restaurant
Yes.
in
Went through all the
Gatlinburg, and you
restaurants.
got that free entertainment as they went around the streets. He did that for a good many years, drumming up business for their programs later. So that family tradition from Henry was handed down through their family.
So most of the Grooms now, they're still in Sevier County, but there's more in Cott County. It's more populated with that family, and then there are still some in western North Carolina. But of course, they've moved around the country now because the war caused them to have to, they moved out of Tennessee and North Carolina because it was so hard to live here.
Any other questions?
Anderson was our great-great-grandfather. Henry, he was Henry and George's brother.
And we think he was probably the younger brother that witnessed this and was the one that went back and got his mother and let her know what had happened.
Well, because they were in the middle of that battle for Asheville at that point. And I figure that the woods were full of soldiers. And so when Teague or his men murdered them, they just buried them. They just got them put away. And it could have been that the Union was coming, that they had, they were trying, there could have been Union soldiers on their tail, and they had to bury those men knowing that they were Union, they called them Unionists then.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Well, that's a little sketchy because Amanda, who was Henry's daughter, it's also been told that she found them. But according to what Papa has written out, was someone whom we assume was Anderson came back across the mountain into Cott County and got the rest of the family and went back across and killed somebody, but I don't know who it was. And it could have been some of those, they could have known who killed them. As far as, Teague's men, it could have been people that were their neighbors. We just don't know. And then there was also some other murders of Amanda's. Now that was Henry's daughter, right? Is that right? George's daughter, Amanda. Her fiance, I assume at that time, was a Barnes, and that her fiance's father was also shot that same day. So there's got to be some tie there where they started killing people within that family.
This was not an isolated case. It was happening all over the region at that time. This folktale has got, because of the Groom's tune, has been carried down so much more than a lot of the stories have. It was such a horrible, horrible time that people didn't talk about it that much after it was over. They did not want to remember it, and there was just not a lot of talk about it. Let me give you, for instance, the Battle of Fairgarden was fought along an 8-mile area from about Walter State College up to Douglas Lake to the French Broad River at the time, and there were 165 casualties. We know where 2 graves are. They just plowed over, started growing crops, and tried to forget about that horrible time. It was not, I remember I was in grade school when the 100th anniversary of the Civil War happened. And at that time, my teacher's husband was county historian, the same title that I have now. And so one of the kids said, what are we going to do to mark the 100th anniversary of the Civil War? Because we'd hear on Huntley and Brinkley at night, that they were having all these big celebrations. And she said, nothing. We're not doing anything. It's not anything to celebrate. These people had too hard of a time during the Civil War. 100 years later, there was still that resentment because of the hard time they'd gone through, and they just didn't talk about it a lot. So that's another thing that makes this story so interesting, because of this fiddle tune and the fiddle players handing it down. This story has survived when this type of thing was happening all over the region on a daily basis. They were what was called bushwhackers. They were all kinds of outliers. There's all kinds of the outliers were the ones that were hiding out in caves and things, and their family was slipping in and feeding them, and they'd have scouts that would watch this family go so many days in a row to a certain cave, and then they'd find them and they'd go and murder them there. And these things were happening everywhere, but families didn't always tell those stories, and that's why this one's all the pieces are a little hard to put together, because Eliza didn't sit down and write that down when she got back home. That didn't happen. This has only survived because of this part of it to do with the fiddle tune. That's all that kept this much of that story alive.
Our grandfather didn't talk about this at all. He wrote it down. That was it. The only thing I ever heard Papa say, I think, was that the country would divide again. That the country would, he said, it's not over. And I can remember him saying that several times, that the country will split up again, which kind of interesting today. That, that could be very true in many instances. But I didn't ever hear him say much more about it.
No.
Because it was a terrible time. I mean, their families were dying. Your kids were starving to death. You couldn't go to church. There were no stores, and most of them didn't have shoes. They were all barefoot. And if you had one army coming in taking your pig or your cow and what few chickens you had, then you were going to starve to death for the winter. So most of the men in this area, they didn't want to fight. They didn't want to leave the Union, and they didn't want to fight for the Confederacy, and they didn't want to fight for the Union either. They just wanted to be here in this area, raise their gardens, and raise their families. And like Carroll says, it was a terrible time for this area.
There's this, this far removed, there's this notion that some people have that, they're so proud of their culture, one side or the other. There was nothing to be proud about that war on either side. It was not the people that lived through it would not tell you that at all. That's something that's come forth in more recent times. It wasn't anything that people were very proud of on either side at the time. It was just a very, very horrible time in our history, and it took a long, long time to recover. And like I said earlier, it affected families so that they became even more clannish than they ever were, and some of that remains true even to this day.
Which was obvious with us growing up, because we grew up in the Glades. My Aunt Nadine lived in this house. Papa and Mama lived in this house. We lived here. Aunt Betty and Uncle Lewis lived here. There was a trail through the woods so we could get to everybody's house. So you can see that even during our time as children, it carried through. Papa wanted us in the same area together.
Everyone wants to lay claim to having some connection to the Civil War, it seems like these days. Being the county historian, I was telling these ladies a little bit earlier that I've had, more than once, I've had people come in my office and say that their grandmother or their great-grandmother or someone back had told them about that the first time she voted for Abraham Lincoln. And I was, you don't want to ever say, well, Granny told you a lie. You just can't do that. But there was just a few things wrong with that story. Once of all, your granny would have had to have been 100-something years old when you were born. The second of all, women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. And the third and main thing was Abraham Lincoln's name was not on the ballot in Tennessee in 1860. Things were done a lot differently, and you had to get your name on the ballot in each state, and he could not muster up enough support in the state of Tennessee to get his name on the ballot. So, there's just all kinds of hole in that story, but again, you just have to sit there and smile because you can't tell them their grandma's told them a lie. But things like that has happened over time. Any other questions in here today? Well, we thank all of you so much for coming out. Now, we're going to be up here for a few minutes. If any of you'd like to come up and get a close look at Henry Groom's fiddle, and we'll be glad to talk with you one-on-one for just a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Or that had it from still, he may have had it for some time, or it would have been passed down to him from somebody, so it would have been very old then, right?
We just don't know for sure.
Well, yeah. That's the old one.
And we've not tried to date it because it just, it's just a story that,
Yeah.
that
It's just a family heirloom.
Yeah.
Y'all will probably pass it down to
Is
your
everybody
children.
playing?
Or,
No.
it's not playable.
You can see
I wouldn't want to
parts
try to
missing
play it.
and stuff.
I wouldn't want to try to.
And we don't necessarily claim that this is the exact fiddle. We've got the story and the relatives that
Yeah.
that
Tell us the story.
yeah.
And that's
It's good that